So I think for this video, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. Um, I have a card here. It's the Caramelo Deportivo of Rogelio Matacado Linares. So he played for the New York Cubans in the Negro Leagues toward the very beginning of integration in the United States. And I believe he also spent time in the Cuban leagues as well as the Mexican leagues. Um, what I want to talk about here is memory and history as it pertains to, I think, something like the baseball card. The Caramelo Deportivo said is a great one to talk about this, and Rogelio Linares is a great figure because what we're talking about is kind of like the slipstream of history, and I think we went into this a little bit with this Satchel Paige talk and Cy Young as well. Is that there's a difficulty historically with memory, and especially when you look at the island nation of Cuba, when you look at the Negro Leagues, in comparison to the institutionalized memory of the United States as it pertains to the culture and sport of baseball, you're looking at radically different modes of envisioning and remembering the past, and thus, in a almost deterministic way, creating the future, if that makes sense, right? Because so much of what the past is and represents is a blueprint for what we wish the future to become. And so when I look at a card like this, Rogelio Linares, there's very, very little information on him. It's very difficult to get information beyond a little bit of data from the Seam Heads database, maybe some general kind of encyclopedic entries in Cuban baseball websites that briefly detail his playing career. But as we've seen in the previous videos and the previous talks, what we're looking at and we're looking for really is a human perspective of baseball through the spiritual journey that an individual takes. And baseball is a huge part of the cultivation of a spiritual center or a picture of self, so to speak. And so part of the power of baseball cards, I think, especially when we talk about the modern baseball card, which was discussed in the 1939 Play Ball essay, is the back of the baseball card. So the front is the portrait, and the back is sort of a brief description of that person's name, where they came from, what they've been doing. It's a way, it's almost like a totem of memorializing a moment of time in history. And these are on just little pieces of paper, even as opposed to cardboard. We're talking about a very fragile state of epilogue, so to speak. A fragile state of monument to memorialize these people, right? And so in the grand slipstream of history, so much of what we depend on are these footholds, like these little pieces of paper, these documents, these slips that allow us to denote and notate history. And it becomes difficult, especially in the sort of popular consciousness as a meritocracy of baseball, so to speak. The great figures are memorialized, and particularly the figures from the United States who played in the white leagues, right? So this is where it gets very difficult because you're dealing with an entire history of baseball, which is multicultural. Many different races are involved, many different ethnicities are involved, many different nations are involved. We have not done an adequate job at cataloging history. And this is not due to a lack of effort on the part of any one nation or any one ethnic group or any one racial group. It is due to discriminatory factors. It is due to, for the longest time, the exclusion of Black players, of Cuban players, of players from the Caribbean, of players from Asia, right? It's a failure at an institutional level and a failure at the level of collective memory. And this really drills us down to some really essential human points here. regarding discrimination, regarding in groups and out groups, regarding who gets remembered and who doesn't. And then the sort of abyss of history that unfolds. There's that common quote that history is written by the victors. And Bertolt Brecht, a really great playwright, talks a lot about this in terms of history as a violent conquest narrative. But when it comes to a sport like baseball, and being a baseball historian or thinking about baseball from a philosophical perspective, what you're looking for is a wholeness of experience, an inclusive wholeness of experience, and perhaps it's destined, but I don't necessarily believe it is. When you look at the richness of the history of Cuba, of the Negro Leagues, of the Dominican, of the Caribbean, you're looking at a history that is partially obscured. So if you think of historical consciousness as an attempt to establish transparency between past and present, and thus be able to determine future. When you look at the Negro Leagues and you look at the Cuban Leagues, you're working with an opacity of consciousness, a certain point where you reach a state of total blackness, right? You reach this state of you're reaching into the past to try to understand, but there is no foothold, right? And so the foothold is an institutional or collective consciousness of memory, which helps us understand history through a sort of narrative trajectory or understanding of an individual's lives. And to me, this is a perfect segue from the last essay that we just did on Lefty Grove, Stan Kowaleski, and Ed Walsh, because the historical documentation there is so rich that it allows for the kind of perspective that we just elucidated, which this very deep and profound humanization at a spiritual level of what this person went through, incredibly difficult circumstances in these coal mines in the Rust Belt. Um, but what we have failed and what history has failed through our failure to actually communicate and establish memory across ethnic, racial, and national lines is that we've lost the richness of these entire languages of baseball through our failure to establish, create, and continue collective memory projects. And again, this is why institutions. I really appreciate Seamheads. I really appreciate the Saber Biographies Project, the Smithsonian American History Museum, the Baseball Hall of Fame. Right? When we talk about the importance of cultural institutions like that, what we're talking about is an archival history, which is a process of recovery. And what I really want to zero in on is what is lost, right? Um, and it's difficult to truly know because there's a lot that remains in terms of oral histories that is still being communicated in groups, whether that's Cuban baseball history in groups, whether those occur in Miami, whether those occur in Cuba among elders in the community, as well as Negro Leagues in groups, right? So it's it's this jurisdicted historical moment that's been broken up by segregation, that's been broken up by isolationist policies on the part of the United States. And it's created a fractured or fragmented baseball history through which we attempt to peer and understand, especially to understand someone like Rogelio Linares, who played on some very important teams, including the New York Cuban teams, and was apparently a pretty well renowned power hitter. Um, there's been a span of around 70 years that have passed since his playing career, but to understand him or to attempt to know him or commune with that historical memory of his contribution to baseball has become incredibly difficult because he's not such a popularly renowned figure um, as someone like Satchel Paige or even Cool Papa Bell, right? So, or even someone like Martin Dehigo, right? Or Jose Mendez. Um, we're we're dealing with a real historical consciousness that barely scratches the surface on anything beyond the established historical narratives that are in place in uh, the United States or have been very or are. Let me think of how to it's like the question is, what is lost, right? Or what is being lost, and how can we retrieve it? Because baseball history is a type of human history that goes far deeper than the politicized histories of the battlefronts of nations, of uh, ethnic in groups, of tribal consciousness. It's a collective, communal, um, across borders, across bounds, across languages. It's a real and true universal practice. And again, I've said this before, it transcends language because it's the immediacy of the game itself, right? You step onto the field and you play, and a lot of the players that come to play in the United States or go to play in Cuba, there's a massive language barrier. They can't communicate with each other, but they can communicate on the baseball field, right? Because there's that innate understanding that supersedes language. And so this is what I love about baseball as a way into a real historical or political consciousness that transcends a lot of the kind of detritus that people mistake for real political consciousness in today's day and age. Is that um, it's a human reclamation project of history. And so when you look at the United States of America, particularly among white ball players and white immigrant ball players, the narratives are well established and they're well in place in these institutions. We're we're in the process, and I think there's a long overdue reckoning at a collective level of understanding just how important the contributions were in the Cuban leagues and in the Negro leagues, and to write that into the data banks of our collective communal history books, right? And to make sure that that is well founded and that that history is rich and that ground is fertile, so that when you have historians and philosophers of the future that come and they kind of pay visit to these archives and understand the importance of baseball at a global level, the narratives and the stories and the information available is sufficiently rich to the point of that human spiritual level where you get the full gravity and gravitas of the people who laid the bricks in this foundation of the sport, the collective sport, right? So when I look at it now, right, or when I try to look at it now and I try to enter into this archive, you can see this incredibly rich United States white only historical consciousness that existed all the way up until Jackie Robinson breaks the integration barrier. And then you have the institutionalized history shifts, right? The aperture shifts. And then you have Minnie Minoso, you have Jackie Robinson, you have Larry Doby, right? You have Don Newcomb. You have the acceptance into the institutional narrative, which is the empirical archive, so to speak. Um, and that ends up it actually is incredibly important, because what that is it's a institutionalized, protected, well documented, well serviced, well funded history that is the data bank, which is the epilogue, which is the keeper of the keys, so to speak, for the collective communal history of baseball. And the importance of something like that is essential, but it's very clearly connected to and tied to the institutionalized narrative of baseball, which existed upon the institutionalization of baseball in the United States. If you understand what I'm saying, is that the attempt to institutionalize black baseball with Rube Foster and the Negro Leagues was the attempt to create an institutionalized communal data bank, a collective system, a way of being which could be documented, which could be established, which could be exchanged, which could be communicated, right? That's the importance of the creation of the Negro Leagues. And it's a similar function with the Cuban leagues, is that you have this simultaneous process of myth making and myth keeping, history making and history keeping, which is the essential importance of the archive, the historical, institutional, foundational, collective archive. It's the collective memory system that we refer to, that we use to recall history. Again, this is the importance of the Saber biographies. This is the importance of the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? These are documents upon documents in archives that allow us to you have a historian or a philosopher enter into that arena, and you can assemble a deeper, more rich picture of history than perhaps was even possible at the time that the history occurred, which is a redemption, it's a reclamation, and it's a historical restoration of spiritual consciousness within humanity. So this is the, I think, the real big sort of elephant in the room, so to speak, and the big roadblock that's occurring in terms of baseball history is that from what I've just been able to pull together on my own research and in talking with Cuban baseball historians and attempting to understand the foundational origins of Cuban baseball, um, this history has not been sufficiently protected, right? And it's a failure on an international level, right? Because the importance of this history has been segregated, right? It's been separated by national borders, and there's been a failure in a humanitarian way, and from a humanitarian perspective, that fails all of us, because what we're really experiencing is a lack or an emptiness in the narrative of our collective creation and establishment of the culture of baseball. And a lot of that, just again, it just has to do with racism. It has to do with colonialism. It has to do with the fact that the U.S. is trying to control political interests in Cuba for over a century. Um, all of these factors, right, that go into that. But we need to transcend those factors in order to save and preserve our baseball history, right? Which is something that transcends borders. It passes through borders. It connects us between perceived racial boundaries, right? So this is something that is integral to our human consciousness. And so when I look at this situation, especially when it pertains to Cuban baseball or the Mexican League baseball, um, or the Negro League baseball, beyond the sort of well-established collective narratives around a lot of the more popular players, like the Negro Southern Leagues, for instance, I think is a very important touch point there. Um, there's something beautiful about the absence, but it's also haunting, right? Because you have this fracture or this fragmentation in the scrying glass of our ability to see history that creates this narrative void where you can experience something like this baseball card. I think is particularly haunting and powerful because you have this very well established and very talented baseball player, Rogelio Linares, who played for the New York Cubans in 1945, as you can see on the back of the card. But there's so little information on him. There are some statistics that have been pulled together from the leagues that kept statistical records that have been put into the Seamheads database, and Seamheads is just such a huge part of what we're trying to establish here and what we're talking about. Um, but you have the bottom of history drop out, and I talked about this um, in the Rust Belt Mines episode just a day ago, but it's in a very different context because you have the bottom of history drop out, and you're gazing at the void, which is the lack of historical memory, right? Which is the lack of the ability to see and understand. You have this phenomenon or this emergence of whether it's an individual or a series of individuals or an occurrence. I experienced this a lot and felt this a lot viscerally looking at the Cuban baseball history and the foundations of Cuban baseball, how it was created and established. Is that, and this is something that's beautiful about history, but also terrifying and difficult, right? Because you want to understand, but there's the difficulty in understanding comes from the bridge and experience between past, present, and future, and what can be recalled, right? So whether that's through an oral history that's transmitted ancestrally, whether that's through a series of documents that are recovered, whether that's letters or paperwork, whether that's through baseball cards, right? Like this baseball card here that provides detail and insight, however little or however much. You're looking at a reclamation project of what in reality, right, beneath culture, beneath civilization, beneath all attempts to preserve or create that data bank of historical memory, is a sort of infinite depth and infinite depth of consciousness that is the erasure of history. And that erasure of history on a sort of foundational, natural, objective level is very real. Um, Again, because that without the preservation of an institutional, collective, or cultural archive, that information just fades into the abyss, right? It will be forgotten. It can be and will be forgotten. Um, because that's what culture is. Culture is the data bank of a collective memory that's being created and remembered. It's being kept or nurtured, right? It's the same way that an oral mythology or spirituality is being transmitted through generations, which forms the backbone of any sort of group or culture or tribe. Um, so, and that's the locus or the center of the identity of that group or tribe or culture. So when the bottom of that drops out, and we discussed this in the Cuban baseball history and the origins of baseball in Cuba episode, you have an identity crisis. The center or locus of self has dissipated, right? Either the collective myth or the collective history no longer functions. It's no longer applicable. It's not. It hasn't survived a whether it's a political happening or a war or a fragmentation of the culture or a diaspora. So there's this attempt to recover the essential identity that forms a group or a community or even an individual. Um, and this is something that I think is actually native to the real process of history, right? The process of history beneath and beyond the attempt to establish a collective data bank or memory bank. And so when you have that, it's almost like an inevitable failure of memory. And that's what we're experiencing with the Cuban baseball history and the Negro Leagues history is that um, the archival institutional databases are not well founded enough due to, again, discrimination, racism, um, colonialism, the attempt of the US to control international interests, the attempt of the US to suppress Black consciousness in America, right? These are very real political, economic, and social phenomenon, right, that contribute to the way that this history has unfolded. Um, but it also says something very essential about how history really functions, which is the death of empires and the erasure of narratives through the slipstream of history, right? The inevitability of the sandcastles collapsing on the beach, so to speak, due to the waves of time. And that's what you're really touching, right? When I look at this baseball card here, Rogelio Linares, I feel like I'm viscerally touching the truth of history. And the reason for that is because the entirety of the way that the history of the Cuban leagues itself has unfolded, as well as the Negro leagues, as well as the Mexican leagues, there are these great voids, right? And these great voids are not voids of untruth. They're voids of unknowing, and they're voids of the real consequence of history. In the same way that I don't know, the most the statue that you would think would remain the longest topples into sand, right? Just by the nature of time. It's the Percy Shelley Ozymandias poem, The Hubris of Kings, right? And there's something powerful and beautiful about that. The way that this history so directly touches that, and it's not been sufficiently mediated by the cultural memory banks of history that allow us to bridge the present and the past with these narratives, and it creates this fracture, right? It creates this narrative identity crisis for entire communities and individuals. It is an incredibly difficult thing to deal with in an attempt to recall past and establish present and thus direct future, right? So you're dealing with a spiritual crisis that's occurring on a cultural level, right, as well as an individual level. It's occurring for entire groups of people. You think about this in terms of Cuban baseball or the Negro Leagues. This is not just isolated to baseball. We're talking about a much larger phenomenon of the identity and narrative memory reclamation project of entire nations, of entire groups of people, right? Entire races, entire ethnicities, entire diasporatic groups. So looking at this and experiencing it and attempting to commune with it and be present with the humanity in this is very powerful. And to sit with that void, or in that void state, or in that attempt of memory, and the difficulty of bridging the personal narratives, the oral histories, the ancestral memories that exist in the body with the real simultaneous attempt to create an institutionalized history or institutionalized memory to memorialize and commemorate and understand and create monument for this history, just as it is being swept into the ocean, so to speak, right? So this is an incredibly complex phenomenon. Um, and this is why historical memory is so important, even if it is ultimately a failure or failing, right? And the persistence behind that effort. And that's what's so great about baseball history, is that it's fundamentally a human history through play that bridges and transcends and surmounts obstacles that are perceived politically, but through play and through baseball and through this language that supersedes language, right? That through the language of the play of baseball has been able to bridge uh, politically perceived borders and bounds in a way that very little else can or does. So, just some thoughts here on this. It's a very powerful topic, and you have to look at the United States. You have to look at how international behaviors impact a country like Cuba, right? And what we talked about with what happened in the Spanish American War and Cuba's fight for its independence, as well as its abolition movement, right? The abolition of slavery in Cuba. You have to look at the abolition of slavery in the United States and how culturally there was a deep and profound moral failure in real abolition. It might have happened on a legal or legislative level, but of course that real abolition didn't happen in terms of the political consciousness of America, right? So we have to think about these things and how it impacts our ability, because that on a level is what you mourn and what you grieve, right? Is that if there had been real integrity, right, real political consciousness, which is a consciousness of empathy, compassion, and humanity, right, you would have a deeper historical memory, a deeper institutional memory, a deeper collective memory, and that you would have an archive that was working together to preserve that in real time, right? And so that's the moral failure that I think we experience a lot of the time when we look back in history, is that this is a fragmentation that could have been, I think, in large part prevented if there was real cooperation and real humanity. And I think there's a lot of hope for that through baseball. Baseball being a lens to establish that and retain that and maintain that through collective cooperation, teamwork, in a transcendental language, right? A language without words, so to speak. Um, so I think that's essentially it. Yeah, very, very powerful stuff here. I think that kind of touches on what I was looking to touch here. So I will talk to you guys on the next one.